So it's not exactly that no ultra-large container vessels are sailing to the United States. It's that the ones big enough to matter, the ships over 16,000 TEU, 20-foot equivalent units, are still choosing almost every other coastline on Earth before they choose ours. And here's the part that should bother you more than the headline does. We just spent years and billions of dollars getting ready for them. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this, because the story changed a lot since the last time anyone really explained it, and if you only know the old version, you're going to get this one wrong. If you're new to the channel, take a second, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this is the kind of pattern you want, flagged the moment it shifts, not months after it already happened. Where are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments, because if you're anywhere near a container port on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast, this affects you more than you think, whether your city ever sees one of these ships or not. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this. Understand there are two separate stories tangled together, and most coverage mixes them up. Story 1 is a ship size problem. Story 2 is a Red Sea problem. 2 years ago, they were the same story, because the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea forced every large container vessel heading from Asia to Europe and from Asia to the US East Coast to divert around the southern tip of Africa. And at the same time, American ports weren't built to receive the biggest ships, even if they had wanted to try a different route. Today, those two stories have split apart, and that split is the whole point of this video. Let's take a look at where things stood back then, because you need the baseline. The largest container vessels afloat, ships like the MSC Gulson class, run close to 23,000 TEU. Understand what that number actually means in physical terms, not just as a statistic. A ship like that is over 400 meters long. That's close to 1,300 feet, roughly 61 meters wide, and it draws around 16 meters of water, nearly 52 feet, fully loaded. To put 16 meters into perspective, most American ports historically dredged their channels to somewhere between 45 and 50 feet. And that gap of just a few feet is the difference between a ship gliding in on a normal tide and a ship running the very real risk of scraping bottom. Now understand how we got ships this big in the first place, because it explains everything downstream. Container ship size didn't creep up gradually. It jumped in steps, and each jump was tied to a specific physical bottleneck getting removed. Back in the era before 1980, ships were built to whatever size made sense for the route. Then you got what's called the Panamax generation, ships built specifically to the maximum dimensions of the original Panama Canal locks, completed back in 1914. Those locks put a hard ceiling on ship width and length for decades, so container capacity sat around 3,000 to 4,000 TEU for a very long time, simply because nobody could build bigger and still transit the canal. Then in the late 1980s, some carriers said, forget the Panama Canal entirely. We'll build ships too big for it and route them elsewhere. That gave you the post-Panamax generation, and TEU counts jumped to somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000. This wasn't just a longer hull. When a ship gets wider and longer, the container stacks on deck get taller and wider too, and that means you need shore cranes tall enough and with a long enough reach to service the outboard rows. You need deeper channels, because a bigger ship displaces more water and sits lower. And you need enormous yard space behind the berth to stage all those extra boxes. By the early 2000s, you hit what the industry calls the very large container ship generation, somewhere between 11 and 15,000 TEU. Maersk introduced the E-class and later the Triple E-class, and these ships ran close to 400 meters, over 1,200 feet, with 22 container rows across and 10 containers stacked above the main deck. At this point, you're not talking about a bigger ship anymore. You're talking about a different category of infrastructure demand entirely. Here's the thing that made everything move again. Panama started building an entirely new set of locks in the mid-2000s, finished around 2016, and the Suez Canal expanded its own channel around the same period, finished by 2015. Both canals had been the real constraint the whole time, not shipbuilding technology. Once you widen the locks, ship designers immediately design to the new maximum, and that's exactly what happened. You got the Neo-Panamax class, ships around 366 meters, built specifically to swing through the new Panama locks at somewhere between 12 and 15,000 TEU. And then, because the Suez expansion had no similar upper limit built into its design, you got the true ultra-large container vessels, ships pushing 18, 20, 22, up toward 24,000 TEU, some running 24 rows across and 13 containers high. Now here's why none of this reached the United States for years. You can't just drop a 24,000 box ship into one American terminal. Working a ship that size takes about a week at berth. And if you're unloading and loading that many containers in one place, you back up every other vessel scheduled behind it. These ships only make economic sense on a route with several deep, crane-ready terminals strung along it, so the ship can distribute its cargo across multiple stops instead of dumping everything in one port. That's exactly the model that worked for the Asia to Europe trade, hitting Singapore, then Colombo in Sri Lanka, then through the Red Sea, into the Mediterranean, and across a chain of ports from Tangier to Genoa, to Rotterdam to Felixstowe. American ports simply weren't wired into that kind of multi-stop network, and most of them weren't dredged deep enough anyway. Understand what changed since then, because this is where the story most people still telling this diverges from what's actually happening on the water right now. The Port of Virginia, at Norfolk, brought 4 new all-electric ship-to-shore cranes online at Norfolk International Terminals in late January of this year, cranes built specifically to the Suez-class specification, meaning they're tall enough and have the reach to service an ultra-large container vessel's outboard rows. That gave the port the capacity to handle 4 of these ships simultaneously. The channel dredging project to bring Norfolk Harbor to 55 feet is essentially finished, which will make Virginia the deepest port on the entire U.S. East Coast, deeper than Charleston's 52 feet. A 5th ULCV berth is expected online in 2027. I'm going to pause it here, because this is the detail that should stop you. 55 feet of channel depth comfortably clears a fully loaded 24,000 TEU ship's draft. That bottleneck, the one the original version of this story was built on, the idea that no American port could physically receive these ships, that bottleneck is gone in at least one major East Coast port. New York and New Jersey solved a related but separate problem years earlier by raising the Bayonne Bridge, since some of these mega ships are tall enough that their upper container stacks can't clear a bridge at all, regardless of water depth. Savannah has its own deepening project completed. Jacksonville dredged to 47 feet. The East Coast, port by port, has been quietly building toward exactly this moment. So if the infrastructure excuse is gone, why are you still not seeing regular ULCV calls at US ports, the way you see them at Rotterdam or Tangier? Understand the answer, because it's not infrastructure anymore, it's routing, and routing right now is dictated entirely by what's happening 7,000 miles away in the Red Sea. Here's where Story 2 comes back in, and this is the part that's been whipsawing back and forth all year. When the Gaza ceasefire took hold in October of last year, the Houthi militia signaled they'd pause attacks on Western shipping, and for the first time since late 2023, major carriers started testing a return to the Suez Canal route instead of the long diversion around the Cape of Good Hope. CMA CGM announced a return on 3 of its services, including one connecting India and Pakistan with the US East Coast, a route that would cut roughly 2 weeks off a 77-day round trip and free up 2 ships for other use. Maersk completed a Red Sea transit late last year, its first since the crisis began. Egypt even opened a new semi-automated container terminal at Sokhna Port near the southern entrance of the canal in mid-January, clearly betting on volume coming back. Then in March, everything reversed. As fighting escalated between US, Israeli, and Iranian forces, reports emerged that commanders had effectively closed the strait to shipping, mirroring restrictions Iran was simultaneously threatening in the Strait of Hormuz. Maersk and CMA CGM suspended their Red Sea plans again and went straight back to the Cape route. The Gemini Cooperation reversed its own decision to reroute a service from India through Suez. An industry analyst described it plainly at the time, saying further military escalation would shatter any hope of a large-scale Red Sea return this year. Understand what that reversal actually costs in concrete terms. Analysts estimate the longer Cape of Good Hope route currently absorbs somewhere around 2 million TEU of capacity, that would otherwise be available for other trades, essentially locking up ships and crews on longer voyages instead of freeing them up. And every ULCV committed to the Cape route is a ship that isn't available to test a new American port relationship, because these vessels are already fully scheduled on fixed loops built around Asia to Europe demand. Now here's the piece that connects both stories directly, and it's the reason the US ended up building capacity for ships that mostly aren't showing up. The original congressional hearing on this exact issue happened in the House Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and lawmakers spent real time on Red Sea disruption, specifically because of its infrastructure implications. Understand the logic they were working through. If large carriers get squeezed out of the Suez route long term, the economic pressure to find new deployment options for their biggest ships increases, and the US East Coast, sitting on the other side of the Atlantic from Europe, becomes one of the few remaining places with enough population and cargo demand to justify a direct ULCV service. Ports that get ready first position themselves to capture that shift whenever it actually happens. That's exactly what Virginia did. It didn't wait for a guaranteed ULCV service to materialize before dredging and adding cranes. It built the capacity speculatively, betting that when the Red Sea situation eventually settles into something predictable, whichever direction that settling goes, American ports need to already be ready rather than starting a multi-year dredging project after the ships show up looking for a home. In my opinion, as someone who spent real time around cargo operations, that's actually the correct strategic call, even though it looks strange from the outside right now. You don't build 55-foot channels and Suez-class cranes in response to demand you can already see. You build them because the lead time on dredging and crane manufacturing runs years, while a shipping route can shift in a single quarter, depending on what happens in a strait most Americans couldn't find on a map. Virginia essentially placed a bet years ago that this moment would eventually arrive, and the moment did arrive, just not with the ships attached yet. Here's the actual tension nobody's naming directly. There's now a real mismatch between how fast ports can build physical capacity and how fast geopolitics can make that capacity useful. Virginia can berth 4 ultra-large container vessels today. It could theoretically handle a 5th by 2027. But whether those berths sit mostly empty or become the anchor of a new transatlantic ULCV service depends entirely on decisions being made in Sana'a, Tehran, and Washington. Decisions that have already flipped twice this year alone. Infrastructure moves on a multi-year clock. War moves on a weekly one. And right now the ports are sitting there, ready, dredged, craned, waiting for a geopolitical outcome that keeps refusing to resolve. Understand what this means if you're running a supply chain right now, because it's not academic. If you've been told that American East Coast ports simply can't handle the biggest ships, that information is now out of date, at least for Virginia, and increasingly for parts of the Savannah and New York, New Jersey complex too. The constraint has moved from concrete and steel to insurance premiums and war risk assessments. That's a completely different problem to plan around, and it's one that changes month to month rather than year to year. I'll also say this plainly, because I think it gets missed in most of the coverage focused purely on freight rates. The carriers themselves, companies like Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, and the Ocean Alliance members, benefit enormously if American ports finish this infrastructure build-out on their own dime. A direct ULCV service to a ready East Coast port lowers their per-container cost dramatically through simple economy of scale, and every dollar spent dredging Norfolk Harbor or raising the Bayonne Bridge was public money and public risk, not the carrier's capital. In my opinion, that's a lopsided arrangement. The infrastructure investment carries public risk, while the efficiency gain flows almost entirely to foreign-flagged shipping lines the moment the Red Sea situation finally stabilizes enough for them to commit. So who's really positioned to win here? Who do you think should be paying for this readiness? The ports and the taxpayers who fund them, or the shipping lines that stand to gain the most the day these routes finally normalize? Put your answer in the comments, because I want to see where people actually land on this one. Understand where this leaves us right now, today. The technical excuse for no ULCVs on the US East Coast is gone. What's left is a waiting game tied to a conflict zone thousands of miles away, one that's already reversed course twice in the space of a few months. The ports did their job. The rest of the story is being written in the Red Sea, not in Norfolk. Until next time, this is where we leave it. If you found this useful, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you catch the next update the moment the Red Sea situation shifts again, because it will. Leave a comment, share it if it helped you understand what's actually going on. And if you want to support the channel directly, there's a super thanks button below, or you can join on Patreon as a monthly or yearly supporter. Until next time.